Hey everyone. This video is going to be about something on which I've been dwelling, something I've been thinking about a lot more and more lately than I have in the past. Death. The end. The end of consciousness. The end of everything. Now, I've thought of there have been many times throughout my 20s where I've thought a lot about death. Mainly it was times when I felt really up against it, where I just felt so bleak and hopeless that there was no way out, no light at the end of the tunnel. And I would think about just how much more satisfying it would be to get it over with, essentially. And I know that I'm not the only person who thinks like this from time to time. I think many of us do. However much the polling data shows us people think about suicide, I suspect the real answer is always higher than the polling data shows. I've especially been thinking about death more and more, considering what happened to my father last year. Because when we lost him, as we were all gathered around him while he was breathing his final breaths, while the readings on the ECG were getting closer and closer to zero, while the paramedics were informing us that basically either we would have to let him go or we'd have to resuscitate him and he'd come back as a vegetable. Experiencing a death in the family like that, it really goes to show that, well, there's no experience like that to penetrate through into your daily life as a reminder that this will be your fate eventually. You will die, and coming to terms with that, however you come to rationalize it, there's no way that death will not be terrifying in some way. And there are many people who claim to have accepted it. There are many people who claim they have the answers. At least that is what they say they do. But how they come to terms with it in their own heads is a different matter. Most of us choose not to think about death. Most of us choose to preoccupy ourselves with distractions by engaging with material things, watching films, playing video games. We don't like to think about the big questions because they're not just big, they're huge. They're terrifying. As I've said, it doesn't matter how you rationalize the end of consciousness, it's never going to not be terrifying. And even though it's a waste of time to reflect on what may happen to us, what we might experience in our final moments, that doesn't stop us from trying. This is the stuff that poets, philosophers, and writers, and religious priests have expounded upon for centuries, for millennia. I think the oldest story in the entire world, in human history, is the story of the Sumerian king Gilgamesh. And I haven't read the story, but I understand that one of the central underlying themes of the story is Gilgamesh's fear of death and his quest to achieve immortality. At some point, maybe I might read that story and give some more nuanced thoughts on it now once I understand the story in context. But basically, the fear of death has been around since time immemorial. And we wouldn't exist now without it. Our parents wouldn't have had children were it not for their biological primordial directive to pass the buck, to have children as a means of outliving them, and the same goes for their parents, and theirs before them, and theirs before them, and theirs before them, and theirs before them. In this way, death and reproduction are, well, they're heavily intertwined because because of what I mentioned earlier. However, beyond the instinctual fear of death that we have, the fact that when we haven't consumed food in a while, we feel hunger, which is our body's way of telling us we need to consume more food, otherwise we might die. Beyond the innate fear we have of heights when we're standing at the top of a tall building, the dizziness we experience, warning us that if we make one false step, we'll cease to exist, we'll die. There are deep philosophical reasons for our fear of death, which I don't think people think about enough, which I think need to be coherently articulated, and this video is going to be my attempt at doing that. This video isn't scripted, by the way, and I'm probably going to repeat myself, or I'm probably going to say things that sound silly or nonsensical, but here are my thoughts. The way I see it, there's three essential underlying components to our innate fear of death, and these are separate, mind, to our biological instinct that we have that teaches us to avoid dangerous situations at all cost and to consume food and reproduce, because those, while they're valid and legitimate, they don't count. So anyway, the first reason is well, it's the uncertainty of knowing how it will happen to us. You know, as said in the 2000 Ridley Scott movie, Gladiator, we all die one day. We cannot choose where or when, but we can choose how we meet that end. Well, well, that's not always true. I don't think my dad had any idea that he would spend his final days in physical agony, bedridden for most of the time, unable to take off with his new business career as a building surveyor due to skin cancer. He might have had inspirations here and there as to that it might have killed him, but I don't think it's what he counted on. I don't think it ever occurred to my dad throughout his 20s or 30s that he would lose his life in his late 60s, at the age of 68, I believe, to skin cancer. And, well, if it had, he probably would have worn more sunscreen. He might have visited the doctor more often. But anyway, there's my dad lived a very long life, and lots of people die from skin cancer, and the circumstances around cancer and other diseases that elderly people experience, they're too numerous for any of us to even contemplate. But the point I'm trying to make is that you can't always be in control of the circumstances by which you will arrive at the end. And that in itself is frightening, because they could be pleasant and peaceful. You know, you could be surrounded by your friends and family and your loved ones, which my dad was. I don't think he could have, well, considering the reality of the situation, I don't think he could have counted on anything better, especially because I had to go to work later that day, and well, I think all of us had jobs, and it could have happened while we were all at work, and he could have died alone, or he could have died with most of his children not being there by his side. And, well, it's purely down to a twist of fate, that didn't happen. But that doesn't change the fact that there are many others who don't get to experience that level of closure. There are elderly people whose brains are rotting of dementia in hospices, in nursing homes, who probably die without any sense of lucidity, of knowing who they are or what's happening to them. And there are people whose lives are cut short suddenly. People who are stabbed to death by criminals. Or in the case of one particular person who I mentioned in a previous video, whose life was unexpectedly snuffed out in a cruel and brutal manner by some illegal immigrant psychopath who just set her on fire for what appears to be no reason. Life is like a thread at times. It can be snapped at any given moment. And while the peace and the bliss that comes with oblivion, that is, not being, the state of non-existence where you can be certain that you won't get to experience any more sudden misfortune, that may be some measure of comfort, but we still don't know how we're going to get there from A to Z, from A to B. And that is one reason. That's one particular reason as to why it's frightening. Especially considering, if you look back through the historical archives, there are countless stories of people who met horrific and brutal ends that would just make us sick to our stomach. It'd be a waste of time for me to list them here, but I'll give you just one example. There's one standard issue punishment for people who, I can't remember what the official charge was, whether it was treason or heresy or whatever, but there was one particular execution method called the oubliette. Now, what was the oubliette? It's essentially when you're cast away into a dungeon that opens via a trap door in the floor. They chuck you down there in a dark pit with no lighting, no food, and no water, no drinking water, and they close the dungeon, and you're literally left there to rot until you starve to death or until the rats eat you, because that's a thing. There was I think there was in some of these stories there's a small layer of water at the bottom, and where rats crawl around and sometimes they eat or torment you. And yeah, just imagine experiencing something like that. One small comfort, one small moment, one small solace we can take in this modern age is knowing that in all likelihood we probably won't get to expire in a manner that isolating and that horrific. But still, it doesn't change the fact that that is what has happened to people throughout the ages, and much worse. And I'd go over time if I took the liberty of explaining all of them or even some of them here. But you get the idea. So first of all, that's basically the first reason we're frightened of death. We can't choose how we die. We don't get a say in how that happens. Not most of the time, anyway. So that's uncertainty of knowing. The second reason that we're frightened of death, and this is something which, again, I don't think gets enough credit, which I personally don't think that a lot of people think enough about, is the fact that it's the end. It's the end of consciousness. So think about who you are. Think about your identity. What are you really? Your identity is based on compounded knowledge and compounded knowledge that's been accrued over the course of years and decades, depending on how old you are, which is in turn based on aggregated experiential consciousness derived from sensory input data through what you've seen, heard, tasted, felt, touched, and experienced. Essentially, your mind is a collection of data, and this data has been collated, it's been organized and structured in a way so as to give you a perception, an illusion that you are the person you think you are. And this perception, this illusion, I'll explain why it's an illusion in maybe a different video, but this illusion is what we refer to collectively as you, yourself, your identity. This determines how you perceive the world, how you interact with its surroundings, what reality is to you. But what happens when that comes to an end? What happens when there's no sensory input data anymore to process, and all the memories that you've accrued up until this point cease to exist? You aren't able to process, to contemplate what happens after that, because it's the end. It's the end of everything. It's the end of you. It's basically the end of the world. Because as humans, we have a solipsistic, a myopic view of perceiving the world. We mistakenly perceive ourselves as a conscious, separate entity that is external to our surroundings. This is in spite of the fact that we are made up of a mix. We are essentially made up of, what are we made of? Carbon, oxygen, and water, all the ingredients that the rest of organic matter is made of. And yet we formulated an identity based on compounded knowledge and information that is stored away, and one day all that compounded knowledge will basically be shredded. It will disappear in an instant. And I don't think people take a moment to think about how frightening this is, because, well, I don't need to explain why it's frightening. It just is. What happens to you after that? Well, there is no you for it to happen to after that point. Even if you're somebody who is morbid, depressed, and who has a lot of suicidal thoughts, even if you're in the position where you're thinking, my life is so profoundly miserable, I'll surely be better off once I've checked out, as it were. Even that person isn't in a real position to process just how frightening it is to transition from being to not being. And that's, in a nutshell, that's the second reason why death is so frightening. And then there's the third reason, the third and final reason, which I've saved for last because I consider it to be the most frightening of all. It is what we experience and what we see in our final moments, in that transitory stage between being and not being. And this has been the stuff that poets, religious, messianic figures, and writers have long since expounded about over the years. It goes without saying that what happens after we die, what happens as we're dying, is and always will be unknowable. There are lots of things, however, but because it's unknowable, that doesn't stop us from trying to imagine. Even though it's a waste of time to speculate what happens to us at the end of consciousness, that doesn't stop us from trying. Because as humans, we've been blessed, or cursed, depending on how you look at it, with the capacity to reflect and intellectualize our position, to make sense of what there is. And that's one of the key differences between ourselves and animals, because animals don't waste time thinking about death. Even though they are afraid of death, every bit as afraid of death as we are, but they don't waste time thinking about, is there more to life after this? Only we are capable of that. And that in itself adds a new dimension of uncertainty and fear to death, because it leaves us to wonder, what will we see? What will we experience? Will it be pleasant or will it not be pleasant? And when I was seeing my dad, when he was drawing his final moments on the living room floor of our house, the entire time there was no evidence to say that he was conscious enough to process what was happening to him, because he was already unconscious. His eyes were closed, his mouth was agape. So whatever he saw and experienced, whatever he was happening to him as we were losing him, there's simply no way of telling. We don't even know if it was positive or if it was negative, but I wouldn't say that there was any evidence as such to say that he was experiencing something negative. However, recent emerging clinical literature in the field of science, in the field of medical science, has shown that when a person dies, when the brain dies, the brain remains active for a limited time. I can't remember exactly how long. I think it ranges from 3 minutes to 5 minutes, because there is the neuronal activity, synaptic connections can be observed in the brain even after death, even after the brain is clinically dead. In much the same way, we think that when we switch off a light bulb, the light bulb just flickers off like that. But there are still traces of an electrical current flowing through the bulb, and it takes time. It takes a little bit of time for the current to dissipate, and that's essentially what happens. You see, this is a thing that a lot of people fail to understand. Death is not as simple as a light flicking on and then off. It's a process. There are stages to death. And in the earlier stages, we are cognizant of what is going on. There is evidence to suggest that we are. And this leaves room for doubt. This leaves room for the possibility that we may see or experience something that it is not otherwise possible to experience. And this is where the whole subject of NDEs come into place. NDEs, that is near-death experiences. And I'm gonna broaden this out and talk about this in a separate video, because that is frankly worthy of a different video. But there's not everyone. All right, hold on. Let me start from the beginning. So, due to the advances in medical science, because we now live in an age where it is possible to save people's lives at a point where nature would have otherwise already cut them off, it is possible, in a sense, to bring them back from the brink of death. This has been happening more and more throughout the 20th century. And there are stories that have been collected over time of said people. This is not, by the way, this doesn't happen with every single person who's been rescued from the brink of death. However, it has happened enough, and commonly enough, to the point where basic patterns and commonalities have been observed. A lot of the times, these people and the circumstances of their death vary and range to a very wide and large degree. However, there are things that they claim to have seen and experienced, including floating off from their body in a sort of astral form, being able to observe their surroundings, being cognizant of the fact that they are dead, so and that they are alive and they are not dreaming, being able to observe and hear the remarks of the doctor who is there, because a lot of the time these NDEs take place in a hospital, you know, go figure. And then there's other things that they claim to experience is seeing a really bright white light, the sense of rushing through a tunnel and seeing a bright light. Also, in some of these stories, they see long dead relatives, people who they know are dead. And in some stories, if these accounts are to be believed, they see the faces and the presence, the feel of presence of people who they weren't even aware were dead at the time, but have since later found out had died. Now, obviously, a lot of these stories aren't verifiable, and I will talk about them a lot more in this next video. However, what makes this in itself would not be so terrifying were it not for the fact that, first of all, in addition to the fact that not everyone gets to experience this sense of unmitigated warmth and love and bliss, not every experience is pleasant. Some of them are distressing. Some of them are frightening. In some of the stories, there are people who have had the inverse. There are negative, or as they're called in the literature, distressing NDEs. And it's impossible to survey the opinions of every single person through history who has died. I mean, obviously, I don't think the technology will ever exist for us being able to do that. And we're still, however many, God knows how many years or centuries worth of neuroscience away from being able to analyze and interpret the data from the brain of a person who is on the brink of death, to analyze what's going through their heads in their final moments. But there does always remain the possibility that you could experience something more terrifying and more frightening than you could even imagine. Even though it may well be the final experience you ever get to have, and after that there's nothing, the possibility is still there. And even though these stories are simply not verifiable in any empirical sense, we do know that the brain does remain active for a limited time after being clinically dead, while the organs are shutting down in the body, and well, before that, I think. Actually, I think the brain is the first organ to go down, and then the rest comes after. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. The possibility remains that the transition from living to dead may not be a pleasant one. You may find yourself confronted with your conscious manifesting itself in a vibrant and hyper-real form, where you're confronted with past deeds that you regret, things that you wish you'd done but hadn't, or your worst fears or worst nightmares. I'm gonna talk about that a bit more in my next video. But anyway, I want to wrap this video up with something that I should have discussed earlier. So even though death is frightening, for all the reasons I gave, that doesn't stop us from thinking about it from time to time, because we're all fairly certain that however miserable we are, by the end of it, we won't exist anymore, and we won't have the capacity to reflect on our misery, as we ourselves, the compounded network of information that constitutes our identity, which in turn interprets and analyzes our feelings and assigns meaning to each one of them, will not exist anymore, thus being the justification for why we think about death a lot. It doesn't matter that death is frightening. That doesn't stop us from thinking about it. Even those people who are not depressed, even those people sometimes think about death, and we try not to. But death is always there. It's waiting for us. And you've got to be ready for it. And that reminds me, there's a particularly memorable episode of Family Guy. I don't really watch Family Guy. I mean, I used to, but it's a generic American cartoon comedy show. It's not for everyone. But there is one episode that I remembered and that I thought more and more about recently. The episode is one, I can't remember if it's a 1 or 2-parter. It's an episode where Stewie and Brian go to visit their local bank to make a withdrawal. However, as it's a Saturday and it's late in the evening, they go just before closing time, and while they're inside the vault, the bank closes and they're locked inside the vault. And because it's the weekend, they're locked in there for a whole day, for a day and a half. And the entire episode consists of both of them being trapped in there. And it consists of just nothing more than dialogue between the two of them, and a bunch of stuff happens. Stewie needs to go number 2, and because Brian's a dog, he basically eats it, which is gross. But anyway, at one point, Stewie discovers to his shock that Brian actually keeps a revolver inside his vault, inside his account. And Stewie asks him, he turns to him at one point in the episode and asks him, "Brian, why do you keep a gun?" And Brian confesses to Stewie, "Well, because I'm not happy a lot of the time. I feel depressed, and I keep a gun in the comfort of knowing that if my life turns out terribly, there's a way out." And Stewie is genuinely shocked to hear this, because in spite of everything, the whole plot of Family Guy is essentially, there's a rivalry between Stewie and Brian, and that there are episodes where the two beat each other up and try to kill each other. But in spite of this, Stewie is genuinely shocked to hear this, and he accuses Brian of being selfish, because in spite of everything, he sees Brian as a friend and as family. And it just never occurred to Stewie up until that point that Brian thinks about death a lot, and he may one day, if the going gets really tough, put an end to it. Now, obviously, this is just one episode of a long, drawn-out and, well, let's be real, overrated American comedy show with crass, vulgar humor. But it's highly likely, I refuse to believe it's not the case, that Seth MacFarlane, the writer for the show, was trying to vicariously express, through the thoughts and words of his own characters, what a lot of people, especially those who are in countries where it's legally possible to own a gun, what a lot of us secretly think from time to time. The fact that life is full of reversals of fortune, and there's a lot of suffering, and there's a lot of uncertainty and unexpected twists and turns that make life quite unpredictable and chaotic, and we're never sure how we're gonna come out at the end of it. And there is some comfort that comes in knowing that if things get really terrible, there's a way out. And I've thought about this more and more, because obviously, well, there are lots of people who secretly think like this. Now, obviously, there is a difference between thinking about death and actually making plans to get to that stage. Speaking as somebody who is 30 years old now, I can't definitively say whether I'm any closer or further making plans to checking out, as it were, to rage quitting from the game of life. I've got to use these silly euphemisms because YouTube is quite funny with censorship of its content that promotes self-harming and suicide. But there have been times throughout my early adulthood where I did seriously come close to considering it. Looking back, I would say, because I was raised in a loving knit family with, up until recently, my mum and dad both being together, I had a strong social support network in place. You know, giving me emotional succor and help, and giving me help and financial support if things went wrong. But if I didn't have that, if I didn't have a loving family, if I didn't have the social support network I do, would I even still be around? I honestly can't give a straightforward answer to that question. I suspect maybe the answer might be no. And I think one of the reasons why even now, despite everything, I make an effort to take each day in stride and try and work towards some goal. It's not because I love life, far from it. It's because I don't want to leave my family in the position where they're having to move on without me being there. Because there are all kinds of reasons why we might want to end our lives. But when you see the impact that suicide has on the friends and family of those who have left, there are YouTube videos I've seen. It's understandable, but it is also selfish, and you can't truly extricate yourself from the accusation of being called selfish if you do go through with it, because it is devastating. I mean, I've seen the grief in the faces of people who have made videos about losing friends and losing family members to suicide, and it's absolutely wrecked them. Now, do I want to do that to my family? Of course not. But that doesn't stop me from imagining it from time to time. And that's just one of many reasons why, even now, I still continue to think about it. And a lot of us do. I think it's highly likely that if you're watching this video, if you've continued to watch the video up until now, there's a good chance you've thought about it as well. You probably agree with me on many things. Anyway, goodness me, 37.5 minutes. This may well be one of the longest videos I've ever recorded in a single take. I got to finish my collection, but there's more to come. Take care, you guys, and I'll see you later.